thank you so much, Professor Cheng, for inviting me. And I've been in HKU before, but I've never spoken in this kind of magnificent room. So I'm very, very happy to be here. So some context for this project, I think, is good. So I've been doing law and tech basically for 5-6 years. And my original interest was, like most of us, platform regulation and looking at the effects of platforms specifically on the nation state writ large. So about how do they impact all sorts of social and political processes that are required for a thriving polity. Okay, so that's basically the big project. And as a part of that, at some point, I've started looking at questions of the legitimacy of social media or legitimacy of digital information platforms generally, because I thought that a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about the regulation actually misses some of the story. And again, my basic understanding, my basic argument that I've made in a couple of articles is that generative AI, the thing that we call AI in that title there, or machine learning models of all sorts, fundamentally much of what we're talking about is very similar in its effect and its dynamics than algorithmic power before we started calling things AI, recommendation algorithms, content moderation algorithms, and now generative algorithms. So therefore, it's kind of natural for me to start looking at questions of legitimacy with AI. And then I started looking at how these companies present themselves, which is often how you figure out what they think are their problems. And I've kind of looked at what they call constitutional AI, which is the way Anthropic represents its model, and wrote a paper about that a year ago. And then I started saying, okay, I need to write something more general about this question of regulating for AI legitimacy. So the argument of this paper, which is going to get published, but I'm still working on potentially a different version or a more expanded version of it. Therefore, I would really appreciate feedback. Is a kind of a simple argument, and I'll make it in a complex way, but it's simple. The argument is that when we come to regulate AI, we should aspire, and one of our goals needs to be to open the door for its legitimacy. Another way of saying that is to open the door to its integration into our pre-existing legitimate political and legal structures. So that is kind of the project, and I'll try and justify it and give you my thoughts. Again, this is to a large extent requiring some thought experiment dynamics. So a lot of what I'm saying is going potentially to be relevant a few years from now, even though most of the drama has not occurred yet. Okay, so I want to say that AI is already governing, or again, algorithms are already governing to a large extent. For example, the most dramatic example is its effect on human speech and information consumption online. So we're talking about billions of content units, text, videos, music that are being generated, recommended by algorithms, and content moderated by algorithms. Okay, so fundamentally, maybe to make it the most in explicit terms, it is the most audacious, ambitious, expanded speech regulation in the history of humanity, by far, right? Talking about billions and billions of pieces of information that are constantly going through these algorithms. Now, parallel to this, we see a growing, but still budding, still starting integration of algorithms into public power. So like explicit public power, administrative agencies, courts. Again, a lot of this is still spoken about and not implemented. There's a lot of speaking about it. And I think there's very likely going to be a big transformation of these powers. So therefore, there's actual governmental public power that is being implemented through these algorithms in different ways. And as you've seen here, I've walked from public to private power. A part of what I kind of hold in my work, and again, we can argue about it in the discussion, is that at some point, these private entities have enough power, enough influence, and an influence of a certain type that it starts getting experienced as a form of public power. Again, this is especially true on the speech and search elements of companies like Google, Facebook, etc. And therefore, the need for some sort of political legitimacy, and again, I'll define what I mean by legitimacy in a second, expands between private and public power. I'm writing a paper now trying to say that part of what happens is that the idea of having completely distinct private and public spheres, it has been undermined for many years, but it's being further undermined by the power of these platforms. Okay, so another type of way of expressing my argument here is that focusing on alignment is not enough. Why? So alignment is basically trying to ensure that these machine learning systems do what we want them to do, act in ways that are kind of in line with our values as humanity, as you know, certain polities. So this starts from, you know, not killing humans, kind of not creating apocalypse discourse, all the way to how do we create these models to be without bias. Both of those, in my account, are questions of alignment, so actual functioning of the models in some way. Legitimacy, in the way I use it here, and again, there are many ways to use the word legitimacy, is the question of whether people accept the authority of behind certain decisions, right? So we can call it, in simplified terms, sociological type of legitimacy. And this is kind of audience side question rather than model side question. And the reason why we need to ask both questions is because there could be very good very aligned systems that are completely rejected by the population. So you can have a very good, efficient, aligned system and still have a legitimacy crisis. And the legitimacy crisis in itself is something that we should be very concerned about. Because legitimacy crises, again, might lead to good things, but quite often lead to deep problems, which we might want to avoid. So that is why alignment and a focus on alignment is not enough. And the thought that from alignment automatically follow legitimacy is also not true. There is a relation between performance and legitimacy. So if you think about automated cars, for example, there is a relationship between the quality of the driving, the fact that they don't go into accidents quite often. Eventually that creates acceptance, right, in San Francisco, etc. But it requires a much, much higher threshold of performance in some way in order to get that acceptance, rather than if there's a human behind the wheel. So this is not a perfect analogy, but that is kind of an understanding of why this, I think, is important. So, and again, we've learned this lesson on our, political flesh over the last 20 years with digital platforms. So to a large extent, digital information platforms have been incredibly aligned, right? They've done a lot of things really, really well. So our access to information, our ability to publish and get to an audience, our ability to, get tailored entertainment that we are actually interested in, rather than, just reading what everyone else is reading or watching whatever everyone else is watching. All of these, I think, are arguably huge improvements over the former system, right? However, at some point, this improvement also came with a concentration of power in these digital platforms, and they became what Svetlazar calls algorithmic authorities, and therefore people started asking for legitimacy from them. They've done a bunch of legitimation tactics. I'm not going to go into it, but if you want, I've written a paper about it. Different ways to try and legitimize themselves. The most audacious, the most kind of the thing that academics wrote the most about is the so-called Facebook Oversight Board, which is the attempt for kind of create legal legitimation for Facebook content moderation decisions, which failed miserably. So they've failed. Why? Because no one in their kind of, even though they look like law in many ways, no one has a good answer as to why Mark Zuckerberg should be the one in charge of human speech, right? There is no politically legitimate narrative that explains this reality in some way. And therefore, I argue, is they fail. So the critical lesson from this story is that you can have systems that are dramatically better than the ones that came before them, but they come together with a huge political legitimation crisis or legitimacy crisis, and therefore we pay the price. And we're not going to go into the various harms now of this legitimation crisis, but it's very easy to witness them, I think. So very quickly through this, so alignment questions and legitimacy questions are very different in their content. So for example, alignment questions, so a developer can ask which model capabilities should we gate or disable at launch, and under what conditions can gates be relaxed. So for example, now you're watching OpenAI relaxing its gate on pornography, fundamentally, right? So they're starting to say, okay, our model should be allowed to do that, but they're still not saying that on bioweapon development, right? So they have this kind of alignment questions that they're doing. How do we evaluate what our model is doing? Which red team, bias, robustness evaluations do we do? What type of training data are we using or not using? How do we clean that data? These are all alignment questions. The regulator, fundamentally the same questions, but how do we, what level of kind of what minimal threshold of responsibility do we demand from these models? How do we enforce that? How do we understand what they're doing? All of these are alignment questions. Legitimacy questions are fundamentally different because they're aiming at a different target, right? So in the developer level, which stakeholder do we kind of include in the writing of our rules, wherever they are, or the choosing of our model, the training of our model? How do we adapt? I think really crucial. How do we adapt our models to operate in local places? So for example, how do we adapt them to work in Hong Kong if they were here? Do we train them in languages? Do we train them in local kind of speech norms? How do we do that? On the regulator side, what laws do we write around this that make the regulation clearer and more kind of transparent and available to the public to understand? How do we force the companies to involve the public in different ways? And what kind of appeal mechanisms do we allow? Or for example, if you think about regulation of public use of AI, do we even allow private models to be operated through public power? Or do we demand that only publicly funded and trained models be applied in public administration? Now, I think there are inherent, important problems with AI power that stand between AI and easily achieving legitimation. And again, a lot of this has been learned already from algorithms that preceded generative AI, but I think are true in the same way. So these are the opacity problem, or the black hole problem, black box problem, or a political community problem. So I'll go over them rather quickly. So we know that machine learning models or large machine learning models are opaque in different ways, but the most important way is that they're opaque inherently. So they're opaque because of their complexity. They're so large, so complex, and again, we won't go into the technical details here, that the people who grow these models, not build, but grow these models, don't really understand why the models do what they do. Right? So if you ask, why is Claude a better writer than ChatGPT? No one knows, fundamentally. It's a mystery, because they were grown on different data sets, and that's the way it arrived, right? So one is a much better writer than the other. Why? No one knows, okay? Why is this a legitimacy problem? So I'll just rely on Tom Tyler here. There are a lot of work on this, but I'll read the quote. A key framework for which the public views legal authorities is the perceived fairness of their decision-making processes, including the provision of explanations these authorities provide for their legal decisions. And transparency in legal authorities' decision-making is core to the project of maintaining and building accountability, legitimacy, and trust. So there is an element of understanding of explainability, of transparency, that contributes to the legitimacy of the legal system. Again, I think for us, this is quite intuitive, but it is a problem when you have completely opaque systems creating decisions, right? Or informing decisions, right? It doesn't really matter in that regard. Now, from a legitimacy perspective, there are two types of explanations that can help, two types of transparency that can help. One is a lost cause, as far as I can see, and the other one has a lot of potential. So the one that is a lost cause is what I call individual decision legitimation. So you go to a criminal court, you did something bad, the judge sends you to a few months in prison, and he, or she write an opinion and explain to you according to the law why you're going to prison. That is individual decision legitimation. Systemic legitimation is you understand how the judge got there, what processes the law go through in order to get there, separation of powers, a million other reasons depending where you are, that explain the system that you're under in a way, right? So most people don't understand why a government, passes this or that environmental regulation, right? But they do understand the system itself in some way. And that, I think, has some potential for AI. Okay, second problem is less, I think, obvious and more controversial in the sense that it relies on a specific theory of legal legitimation, which we can, meaning I hold, but you can reject, but I'll be just transparent about what it is. So this is based basically on the work of Robert Post, but not only. So he says, law carries authority because it instantiates the human capacity for judgment, and judgment in his account is includes legal judgment, including legal judgment, depends upon our common participating, and again, in this shared community. As we exercise judgment, we participate in and shape that community. So the judge, but not only the judge, the administrative decision maker, a part of their legitimation, a part of their legitimacy is that they are members of this self-authoring or self-controlling political community, and that political community creates judgment through this kind of process of law. Okay, and I'll say more in a second. So, can AI easily be a part of that? We'll talk about it, I think, a bit more later. But fundamentally, I think the answer is no. I'm going to use Daniel Stater's work here. So he talks specifically about machine learning, whether machine learning can engage in judgment. So I'll start by telling you what his account of human judgment is, and then why AI, he thinks, and I agree, cannot participate in this. So humans make judgments by taking some sort of responsibility, some sort of decision on the normativity of whatever decision they're making. And they constrain future decisions through this, through their own decisions and other people's decisions if they're part of a legal system. Their decision is embedded in what Habermas calls this life world, this cultural practice of law and of judgment. So it's shared, it's embedded in shared social meaning, practicings, and evolving norms. And norms get their meaning in some deep way and their legitimacy from this social practice, right? And they are not only imposed on the social practice, they are a part of it, right? So it's not only people making decisions and then those decisions integrating into social practice. Law is a part of social practice. And therefore, we should understand judgment as this kind of dialectical participation, arguments, critique, revision, precedent, in a feedback loop, okay? Now, can AI participate in this? I think there's a good reason to think not, right? So first, the model, as we all know, can generate things that look very plausibly reason-based, although again, there is a complete detachment between what it says and what are the actual reasons for the producing of that text, right? So the producing is based on correlation and statistics, but the text can look like it's based on something else, and I think that's important. But fundamentally, there is no dialectical participation. The model only participates in culture in as much that in a few years it will be trained again on model. It is, to a large extent, statistical and kind of static, not statistical, and therefore does not engage in this kind of life world, reciprocal or effective practice of law, okay? So again, I can say more about this, but I'll leave it here. You have these two big problems in legitimation of AI power: opacity and political community. You probably have more, but these are the two that I've focused on. Okay. So in kind of the last section of this talk, I'm going to try and produce 3 principles for AI legitimation. But before I do this, I want to kind of say an apologia, like an apology before I do it. So legitimacy in my account and generally is a very contextual thing, right? So if you ask, how do we legitimize AI power in mainland China or in Hong Kong, that is a very different decision. That's a very different answer and how do I legitimize AI power in the US or in France, that is also a very different decision. And these decisions and this kind of like regulating for AI legitimacy, in my account, can only happen on the local level, where there is a relevant political community that legitimizes power. Okay, so that is my account. So therefore, how can I make principles? The principles are very, very general, because the point is you need to think about these things when you try and regulate for AI legitimacy, rather than this is a blueprint that you can just copy paste in each instance. That, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't exist. But what are some kind of general objectives that are going to be part of these principles? So recognized authority. So in the terms of legitimacy, we need to find authorities that are already recognized, already legitimate, and integrate AI into them in some way. Legibility and understanding. So we'll see that relates to some of the principles. So we need to somehow make AI as a technology more legible, more understandable, more familiar to people. There needs to be some sort of remedial second look mechanisms around AI decisions. By the way, these are not necessarily easy things to do, but and finally, this relates to these other three, but local fit, I think, is an incredibly important problem. And one of the major challenges that social media stood up against is that you would have an American-based social platform where the content moderation policies originally were influenced mainly by American values and apply everywhere, okay? So there was a huge problem of local fit of AI power, and that created huge amounts of backlash and problems that, again, we can discuss later if you want. Okay, so principle one, what I call political integration. I'm not sure if the names here are the best in the world, but if you have other suggestions, I would love to hear. So David Beetham was a great scholar of legitimacy, said the following: so power is seen as rightful when exercised according to rules and beliefs that people recognize and can hold to account. And again, the relevant people in this sentence can be many different communities, but in our kind of sense, it is usually on the level of nation states and peoples that legitimize the law of those nation states. So if you want to integrate AI into local instances, what can you look at? You can figure out what is the recognized authority, what is the legitimate authority of that territory. There are usually several. You should relate AI regulation and AI decision-making in some way to that authority. You should name accountability venues in clear ways, and you should deeply respect from the beginning, from the training of models, local variations on different norms, for example, in content moderation, in languages, and in many others. So these are kind of the elements of political integration. We need to take these AI models that are almost all of them at the moment global, either US or Chinese fundamentally, and try and localize them politically in some way. One of the ways, one of the reasons to actually regulate AI, so there's often this kind of anti-regulatory sentiment of saying, if you regulate AI, we're going to make AI less innovative, we're going to have less growth, et cetera, et cetera. One of the reasons to regulate, even if it's true that you'll create less innovation, is because of legitimacy, because the very act of regulating something can, if it is done correctly, generate a dividend in legitimacy. Okay, so you, even if you're losing something financial, it can be worth in the long term in terms of legitimacy. Second is familiarity. Again, and each one of these, I didn't cite the scholarship, but each one of these is basically based on a field of scholarship about legitimacy. In this case, it's what they call civic epistemologies, Sheila Jasnoff, et cetera. So in their kind of story, legitimacy grows when publics can understand how they are governed in some way. So they can recognize, anticipate, navigate how they are governed in serious, deep ways. And therefore, all of the institutions that are involved in AI, the government, the companies, all sorts of regulators, and civil society, all share an interest, although I'm sure the AI companies don't understand this, all share an interest in promoting familiarity with these tools. So how can this happen? So for example, we've already seen this in many places, but we'll see more of this, all sorts of education systems integrating AI literacy into the education system, trying to explain in kind of common sense terms what are these systems, what they are doing, etc. What we don't see a lot is companies actually trying to educate people on these tools. We often see the opposite. We often see some sort of mystification, some sort of an attempt to lie about the nature of these models. For example, the talk about artificial superintelligence and the upcoming, revolution of AI. To a large extent, I think, is based on hype. I might be proven wrong in a few years. And it is a hype that is trying to hide what these tools actually are to a large extent. And I think that's a problem. Because if what you're interacting with is something that these companies say is a digital god in creation, it is very different than if you're interacting with some sort of prediction, very, very sophisticated prediction mechanism that makes mistakes and is a very powerful tool. It's a different thing, right? So I think the companies should, if they were smart about this, try and actually explain what these models are without the hype. Regulators and public bodies should be very clear and explicit and public in how they're regulating, what they're trying to achieve in the regulation, and try and explain this to the public in even more assertive ways than they explain general law. And finally, we should all support institutions like HKU that are kind of independent translators, where we try and understand what's actually happening and try and explain it through civil society institutions to the public. So all of these, I think, are important for this second principle of familiarity. Third, this is based on this kind of procedural justice literature, especially on Tom Tyler, but many others. So they say that people accept decisions when they experience them in some way as fair. So even if it's a bad decision you're unhappy with, you are more likely to accept it, which is how we call legitimacy, if you experience the process as fair, right? So they basically say you need to have voice, the power needs to be neutral in some way, you need to be given respect, and you need to get an explanation. And therefore, we have to aim at this. And again, I'm not going to go into the whole literature on explainable AI now, but we have to push towards having meaningful explanations for AI decisions. And this is not simple, as we've spoken about opacity, right? It might require, a different type of technology. But I think contestation and remedy are a central part, or at least the experience of contestation and remedies are an essential part of achieving AI legitimacy. Just a little bit about this. So, for example, having some sort of impartial reconsideration of AI decisions if they're dramatic enough. And again, we can talk about human in the loop and human outside the loop at some point, but there needs to be an experience of an impartial, serious second look at AI decisions if they're dramatic enough. And again, I think this is principle number 3. So to end, again, I'm not going to give you a settled list of how to create AI legitimacy, but I'll give you a few things that I think are interesting attempts that are happening now. And since I've made this slide, I don't know, a couple of months ago, there's been many others. So one is constitutional AI. As I've said, this is an attempt by Anthropic to design their models and train their models according to a human language, kind of a document of principles that we can understand and the model can understand. And I've written a paper called Public Constitutional AI on how to try and integrate that into public processes of constitutionalization. Number 2 is AI courts, in this case, human courts that look at AI decisions. And again, these are a couple of scientists that try to train models according to this kind of case law, common law type method. And again, there's a bunch of ways of thinking about that, and it relates to constitutional AI in the sense that after you make these decisions, the kind of critical edge of there is that you train the next model with these decisions being a part of the training. Number 3 is publicly governed and trained AI programs. So we see this in many places. The one where it's actually out there right now is in Switzerland. They have this open source AI model named Apertus, who's quite powerful. And again, a part of that is saying, if we think this technology is so dramatic, states need to engage in it directly. You cannot just leave all of this power to private entities. And finally, civic AI literacy initiatives are everywhere. This is just an example from the UAE, where they've rolled out the civil AI literacy in schools. And that, again, will have a lot of potential in the context of familiarity. So these are ways forward. There are many others. And again, the main takeaway I would like to give you maybe is that the goal of AI legitimacy is very, very important, because the real question is not whether the AI model is aligned. That is a question. But the question is whether it's aligned and whether we as humans are willing to accept it. And the law cannot achieve that by itself, right? Obviously, because legitimacy is a social process. But it can open venues to enable greater AI legitimacy, hopefully, right? It's not a sure thing. So again, thank you very much for listening, and thank you for inviting me, and I'm very happy to discuss.